Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the skyscrapers orange and red. In one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, Richard Montgomery, a billionaire famous for his colossal fortune and corporate empire, was dining alone. The atmosphere was elegant but cold, glittering chandeliers, immaculate tablecloths, waiters in impeccable suits. Yet, despite all this luxury, Richard felt strangely empty. He had everything money could buy: luxury cars, yachts, villas around the world. But human warmth, true love, was sorely missed. That evening, his attention was caught by a black waiter, James Carter, who was caring with infinite patience for a little boy sitting at a nearby table. The child, Ethan, was 8 years old and disabled, unable to eat alone. James fed Ethan with incredible gentleness, speaking softly, reassuring him with every bite. Richard watched every gesture, fascinated. He had never seen such tenderness and devotion in life, not even in his most influential social circles. Every movement James made was precise and thoughtful, adjusting Ethan's chair, gently wiping the boy's mouth, smiling at him as if he saw something precious in him that the rest of the world ignored. The other diners in the restaurant were barely paying attention, absorbed in their conversations or on their phones. But for Richard, this moment was overwhelming. One question lingered in his mind: how can a man possess such humanity without having millions? As dinner ended, Richard watched James walk Ethan out the door. James carried the boy's bag, patiently guided his steps, and seemed to be putting his whole heart into it. Richard felt an emotion he hadn't felt in years: admiration, curiosity, but above all, a surge of humanity he had long forgotten. That single moment would change his life. What he didn't know yet was that this encounter with James and his son would force him to rethink everything he thought he knew about wealth, power, and the true value of life. That night, as he watched James disappear into the shadows of the street, Richard felt a spark form within him, a spark that would change his destiny forever. The next morning, Richard couldn't get the image of James and Ethan out of his head. Every detail of the scene came back to him with almost painful clarity: James's gentle smile, the way he adjusted Ethan's small hand to hold his spoon, the infinite patience with which he spoke to him, as if the whole world had disappeared around them. For Richard, this wasn't just a waiter doing his job. It was a life lesson embodied. He decided to return to the restaurant, not for dinner, but to observe once again this rare humanity he had just discovered. When he entered, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere seemed less impressive. All its luxury and power suddenly seemed insignificant compared to James's sincerity. He quietly sat down at a table in the corner, his eyes fixed on the waiter who was feeding Ethan with the same gentleness as the day before. James, intent on the child, didn't notice Richard at first. But every gesture, every smile, every word resonated with Richard like a stark reminder of what he had lost in his pursuit of wealth: patience, love, compassion. At the end of the meal, Richard stood up and took a step toward James. The waiter eyed him cautiously, suspicious but polite. "Excuse me," Richard said calmly, "I just wanted to tell you that what you're doing for your son is incredible." James, surprised, raised his eyebrows slightly, suspicious. "Thank you, sir, but I'm just doing my job," he replied hesitantly. Richard smiled slightly, but his eyes were serious. "No, it's not just your job. It's much more than that. You have something I haven't seen in a long time." James looked down, embarrassed, unsure of how to respond. For Richard, this was a pivotal moment. He had just met someone who embodied the true value of humanity, and he knew, deep down, that his life had taken an unexpected turn. As he left the restaurant, Richard felt a strange excitement mixed with a sense of urgency. He had to know the story of this man and his son. This was no longer a simple curiosity, it was a necessity. The next morning, Richard woke up with a fixed idea: he had to understand James and Ethan's lives. It was no longer curiosity, but genuine fascination. After some discreet research, he discovered the special school Ethan attended and decided to transfer there, claiming an interest in the educational program. When he arrived, he observed James interacting with other parents and children. Despite his position as a restaurant server, James was a pillar of his community. He helped other families, guided parents, and always brought a reassuring smile. Every gesture James made seemed calculated to make the children feel capable, important, and loved. Ethan, with his disability, needed constant assistance, sitting, eating, following instructions. But James never showed fatigue or impatience. He turned every task into a game, every effort into encouragement. Richard, hiding behind a tree, felt his heart sink. He had spent years surrounded by wealth and luxury, and yet he had never seen such quiet strength, such kindness personified. Later, Richard followed James back to his modest apartment. The place was simple but welcoming, toys scattered around, colorful drawings hung on the walls, educational books neatly arranged. Ethan's room, despite his disability, was a sanctuary of creativity and joy. James spoke softly, sometimes humming to distract Ethan, and patiently corrected his son's little clumsiness. Richard realized then that it wasn't money that defined the greatness of a life, but the love and dedication one put into it. James's determination to give Ethan a normal childhood, filled with care and tenderness, moved Richard more than any contract or acquisition. That evening, as he walked home, Richard couldn't take his mind off the family. He knew he had to intervene, but he still didn't know how. Helping James and Ethan seemed natural, but he deeply respected their dignity and independence. The encounter the day before was only the beginning of a deeper upheaval. He felt his life was about to be transformed by these two people he had only just met. A few days after observing James and Ethan, Richard returned to the restaurant. This time, he didn't just want to admire the scene from a distance, he wanted to talk to James. When he entered, the hushed atmosphere of the restaurant suddenly seemed more familiar. James, busy serving customers, didn't immediately notice. But Richard didn't look away. He calmly walked over, and when Ethan was safely seated at the table, he called out to the waiter. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," Richard said in a polite but assured tone. James turned around, surprised, his eyes narrowed in caution. "Yes, can I help you?" he replied, measuredly. "I just wanted to say, what you're doing for your son is remarkable. The patience, the kindness, it's not something you see every day." James frowned slightly, suspicious. "Thank you, but I'm just doing my job." Richard smiled, but his eyes were serious. "No, it's not just your work. You're showing something I've never seen, and I think that's valuable." James looked down, embarrassed. He wasn't used to receiving sincere compliments like this, especially from a stranger. Richard continued. I don't know how to explain it, but I want to learn. Learn how you manage to do this, to remain so strong and so caring, with such dignity." James stared at him, hesitant. There was an authenticity in Richard's gaze that he couldn't ignore. After a long silence, he answered softly. "If you really want to understand, you'll have to come and see it up close. But I warn you, it's not always easy." Richard felt his heart beat faster. He accepted without hesitation. This simple sentence from James marked the beginning of an unlikely relationship, based on respect and sincerity. This moment would change Richard's perception of life, wealth, and family love. As he left the restaurant that night, Richard knew he would never see the world the same way again. James and Ethan had ignited a spark that no billion could buy. A few days later, Richard invited James to meet him at a discreet cafe, away from the hustle and bustle of the restaurant. James arrived with Ethan in a specially adapted stroller, still wary but curious. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Montgomery?" James asked, casting a cautious eye at the billionaire. "Yes, James. I wanted to talk to you about you and your son," Richard replied calmly. "I know you work hard, that you do everything for Ethan, and I would like to help." James shook his head, almost instinctively. "I don't want help. I'm doing just fine on my own." Richard nodded, understanding James's pride and independence. "I understand. But sometimes even the strongest need a helping hand. This isn't charity. I just want to make sure Ethan has everything he needs, and you too." James pursed his lips. He had always refused outside help, proud to provide for his son alone. But he saw a rare sincerity in Richard's eyes, different from that of customers who paid to feel generous. "Okay," James said after a long silence, "if you really want to help, then let me decide how. No useless gifts, no charity. Just support for what really matters to Ethan." Richard smiled, satisfied. "Deal. I just want you to know that I'm serious. And that I respect your choices." This conversation marked a turning point. For the first time, Richard understood that real help was not given in an imposed manner, but by respecting the dignity and pride of the people involved. And for James, this openness, though cautious, began to show that he was no longer alone in his daily battle to give Ethan the best possible life. As he left the cafe, Richard felt a new emotion, a mixture of admiration, respect, and responsibility. He knew that this help would not be a simple financial gesture, but the beginning of a transformation that would profoundly affect his own life. As the weeks passed, Richard and James moved from casual conversations to more personal moments. Richard came regularly, first to observe, then to discreetly participate in Ethan's daily life. One afternoon, he arrived just in time to help James install Ethan in his wheelchair. Richard, clumsy at first, followed James's instructions with extreme attention. "Easy, you have to support his back here," James explained, guiding Richard's hands. Richard nodded, impressed by James's patience and control. "I never thought caring for a child would require so much precision and love," Richard murmured. James gave a small smile. "That's life with Ethan. Every little bit counts. Every little bit makes a difference." Over the course of these visits, Richard learned about Ethan's routine, the rehabilitation sessions, the educational games, the moments of frustration and joy. He saw James juggle these responsibilities with astonishing humility and resilience. One evening, after helping Ethan to bed, Richard and James sat talking in the living room. "You know, James, I thought money could solve everything. But what I see here is something else." James looked at him curiously. "And what then?" "Strength, patience, love, you can't buy them. You showed me what I never understood, despite all my wealth." James looked down, touched, but still humble. "If I can teach you anything, it's that sometimes you just have to be there. No grand gestures, just be there, fully." This moment cemented their friendship. Richard was beginning to understand that he didn't just want to help, he wanted to learn, share, and be a part of their lives. And for James, accepting Richard's presence, without losing his dignity or independence, gradually became second nature. This unlikely friendship, born over a simple dinner, was now rooted in respect, trust, and mutual recognition of what each brought to the other. Richard felt he was entering a world he had never known, that of true humanity. One Saturday morning, Richard decided to spend the entire day with James and Ethan to better understand their daily lives. He arrived early to find James preparing Ethan's breakfast, every step calculated to make it easier for his son to eat. "Good morning, Richard," James said, placing a plate in front of Ethan. "Get ready, it's going to be a long morning." Richard smiled confidently. "I'm ready. Show me what to do." But he quickly realized that nothing was simple. Ethan was being fussy that morning, refusing to eat and pushing James's spoon with his shaky little hand. Richard tried to intervene, but clumsily spilled some food on the table and Ethan. James, without anger, but with calm and patience, guided Richard. "Gently, support his hand here, talk to him, encourage him. Every little helps." Richard felt his frustration rising, but he forced himself to listen. For 2 hours, he learned how to manage his tantrums, adjust Ethan's position, calm his tears. Each success was minuscule, each step forward seemed monumental. At one point, Ethan finally managed to swallow a mouthful, and Richard burst into joy, almost as if he had accomplished some heroic feat. James looked at him and said quietly, "You see, it's not easy. But it's those moments that count. It's not greatness, it's patience, attention, consistency." Richard looked down, touched by this simple truth. He had lived surrounded by wealth, admiration, and success, but nothing had ever taught him humility, perseverance, and responsibility. This morning with Ethan showed him that true greatness lay in the ability to be humble and to devote oneself without expecting reward. As Richard left that evening, he felt a profound change within himself. He was no longer just a spectator or a discreet benefactor. He was beginning to understand the value of human commitment, patience, and true love. This lesson in humility would become a pillar of his personal transformation. A few weeks later, Richard decided to take the next step. He wanted the help he provided to James and Ethan to go beyond financial gestures, but to become a real and tangible presence in their daily lives. He began by remodeling his home to accommodate Ethan, a special space, specialized medical equipment, and even a small educational playroom. But he didn't want to impose his ideas. He consulted James on every detail. "I want you to be comfortable here," Richard said, pointing at the modifications. "Everything I do is for Ethan and for you." James examined the facilities carefully, skeptical but touched. "It's a lot. I don't want you to think I'm leaving everything up to you." "No, I just want to be there," Richard replied. "To participate, to learn, to share what I can to make Ethan's life easier." The first few days were challenging. Richard found himself helping Ethan move around, completing rehabilitation exercises, and even preparing special meals. He stumbled and hesitated, but learned quickly thanks to James's patient guidance. As the weeks passed, a bond grew between Richard and Ethan. The boy, initially shy in the face of this tall, strange man, began to smile when he saw Richard arrive. He sometimes imitated his gestures, laughed at his clumsiness, and gradually opened up to his presence. One evening, as James watched Richard play with Ethan on the living room floor, he said quietly, "You know, I never thought a man like you could really get involved." Richard smiled, moved. "I never thought someone like Ethan could teach me so much." This chapter marked a turning point. Richard was no longer a mere observer or donor. He was now an integral part of their lives. His personal commitment changed his worldview, showing him that love and devotion cannot be bought but must be lived, shared, day after day. As Richard spent more and more time with James and Ethan, he began to reflect on his own family life. Despite his enormous wealth, he realized that he had neglected those closest to him, his siblings, his elderly parents, and even his closest friends. He had always been absorbed by work, acquisitions, and public image, forgetting the most important thing, human relationships. One evening, after helping Ethan to bed and sharing a moment of complicity with James, Richard returned home, immersed in intense introspection. He remembered cold dinners, silent arguments, forgotten birthdays. Each memory now seemed bitter and incomplete compared to the warmth he had seen between James and Ethan. The next day he picked up his phone and contacted his sister, Margaret Montgomery, whom he hadn't called in years. The conversation was hesitant at first, but the words came from the heart. "Margaret. I realize that I've been absent, that I've let years go by without being there for you. I want to change that." Margaret, surprised and moved, replied softly, "Richard, this is unexpected, but I'm glad you see it now. Maybe we can start again." Inspired by James's patience and love for Ethan, Richard began to reconnect with other members of his family and repair long-broken bonds. He realized that material wealth could never replace emotional richness and human closeness. This chapter of his life was a revelation. He realized that James and Ethan's example had ignited in him a profound understanding of what truly mattered. It was no longer just about helping a family he admired, but about transforming his own life and becoming a man capable of loving, supporting, and connecting with others in authentic ways. Richard now knew that his life, until then centered on money and power, had to open up to humanity and compassion. James and Ethan had shown him a path he would never have found on his own. Richard now understood that his role went far beyond observation and discreet support. He decided to take concrete action to improve James and Ethan's lives, while respecting their dignity and independence. He began by funding a comprehensive rehabilitation program for Ethan, with specialized therapists, modern equipment, and sessions tailored to his specific needs. James, initially wary, gradually accepted after seeing the rapid results on his son's morale and mobility. But Richard didn't stop there. He also offered James and Ethan a more suitable home, a bright space with a secure garden so the boy could play and move around freely. Again, James retained control over decisions, but he let Richard invest his resources to improve their lives. "I don't want you to do everything for us," James said one evening. "But if you really want to help, I'll let you be here, really." "I don't just want to help financially," Richard replied with a genuine smile. "I want to learn, be present, and make your life and Ethan's life easier and happier." Richard also became involved in Ethan's education, accompanying him to classes, attending therapy sessions, and participating in daily activities. Their bond grew stronger. Ethan began calling him Uncle Richard, a small gesture that deeply touched the billionaire. Through these concrete actions, Richard transformed not only James and Ethan's lives, but his own as well. He understood that true power lay not in money or influence, but in the ability to change the lives of others and create an environment where love and kindness could flourish. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt inner peace, a sense of genuine accomplishment. His life was no longer just a succession of contracts and acquisitions, it had real meaning, and he owed a lot to this family he had met by chance in a restaurant. It was a sunny afternoon, and Richard had invited James and Ethan into one of his private gardens, a large but intimate place, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The birds sang, the wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time, Richard felt that life could be simple and beautiful, without the shadow of his business and his empire. Ethan ran across the grass, laughing out loud, sometimes helped by James, who patiently guided him. Richard, sitting on a bench, watched this scene and felt a deep emotion wash over him. Throughout their journey, he had learned what no school, no contract, no material wealth could teach him, the value of attention, love, and presence. James walked over and placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You know, you've changed a lot of things, not just for us, but for yourself too." Richard smiled, moved. "Yes, you taught me what I had never known how to appreciate. I had everything, except what really matters." Ethan walked over, stretched out his arms, and snuggled up to Richard. The boy, who had once depended solely on James, now seemed to have found a newfound security and affection with Richard. "Thanks, Uncle Richard," Ethan said with a bright smile. Richard felt tears well up in his eyes. That simple "thank you" meant more than any wealth or recognition in his life. It was proof that his sincere commitment, patience, and love had created a real and lasting impact. As the sun sank behind the skyscrapers, Richard realized his life had been turned upside down in the most beautiful way. He was no longer the aloof man obsessed with power and money he had once been. Thanks to James and Ethan, he had discovered true wealth, that of love, compassion, and human commitment. That day, in that light-filled garden, Richard understood that his most precious fortune was not in his bank accounts, but in those human bonds he had learned to cherish, respecting the dignity and courage of a family that had changed his life forever.